As the pale light of dawn crept over the barren landscape of the concentration camp, April 29, 1945, was just beginning to stir. The day held a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air, mingling with the stench of despair and decay. Guard towers loomed ominously above the fences, their shadows long and foreboding, reminders of a cruel regime that had cast a dark pall over thousands of lives. The chill of early morning settled in, yet for the survivors, the cold felt as if it seeped deep into their very souls, chilling them far beyond physical sensations. Inside the camp, thin bodies huddled together for warmth, their faces drawn and hollow. The remnants of hope flickered like a dying candle, barely illuminating the darkness that had consumed their reality for so long. Each shuffling footstep echoed loudly through the grim alleyways, a haunting reminder of the countless days and nights spent under the watch of merciless guards. Surrounding them was a landscape stripped of life and color, barracked buildings coated in dirt and despair, the earth itself seeming to cry out in anguish at the horrors it had witnessed. Food was a distant memory, a comforting ghost that had long been replaced by an insatiable hunger that gnawed at their insides. Most had forgotten what it felt like to be strong, to feel vitality coursing through their veins, replaced instead by frailty and hopelessness. Whispers of liberation were like wisps of smoke, enticing yet elusive, fading just as quickly as they ignited. Among the survivors was Esther, whose spirit seemed to flicker with the feeblest glimmer of defiance. Her steel blue eyes often scanned the horizon, looking for anything that might shatter the monotony of anguish. Beside her sat Simon, a man whose once proud stature had been reduced to a gaunt frame, skin stretched across bone. He, too, had heard the whispers, the rumors swirling about advancing American forces, but each day that passed felt like a heavy weight pressing down on their hopes. What if they arrived too late? The hours ticked by, blending into one another as the sun began to rise higher in the sky, yet darkness still gripped the hearts of those within the camp. The air, which carried pangs of despair and neglect, now sharpened with an unnameable tension, as if the very essence of time held its breath. And then, on a seemingly ordinary morning that felt like all the rest, the monotonous reality was on the verge of being shattered, forever altering the lives of those who had suffered far too long. Little did they know, the gates that had held them captive, minus a shred of humanity, were about to open, and with that action, all the suppressed screams of their lives could finally rise and echo for the world to hear. The winds of change were stirring, edging closer to their desolate existence, bringing the promise of liberation. In a camp that had rendered them shadows of their former selves, the dawn of a new era whispered through the cracks in their chains, hinting at the possibility that freedom was no longer an abstract concept. As the minutes dragged on, anticipation gripped the survivors. Perhaps this day would mark the ending of darkness and the beginning of their fight for life. The camp, which had become a tomb of lost aspirations, poised itself for an awakening, a moment that would forever be etched in the pages of history. In just a few hours, hope would collide with reality, and humanity would breathe again in the most extraordinary way. As morning light broke over the land on April 29, 1945, a chilling silence enveloped the remnants of the Dachau concentration camp. The air was thick with a foul odor, a suffocating testament to the horrors that had unfolded within its barbed wire fences. It was approximately 7:00 a.m., and the sun cast an eerie glow on the faces of the survivors, who shuffled aimlessly, hopeful yet hollow. They were ghosts in their own lives, echoes of a vibrant past crushed under the weight of despair. Meanwhile, as the Seventh Army advanced through the Bavarian countryside, grim reports of the atrocities awaiting them had begun to circulate. Soldiers, young and hardened alike, gripped their rifles tightly, knowing that just beyond the horizon lay a place of unimaginable suffering. They had heard whispers of the conditions, of the emaciated bodies, the rampant disease, and the haunting cries of the living dead. They were motivated not just by a mandate to liberate, but by a deeply ingrained sense of justice for those stripped of their humanity. Staff Sergeant John Miller, a seasoned soldier, kept the men focused. "This is about more than the fight," he urged, his voice steady above the rumble of vehicles. "These people need us. They need to see they're not forgotten." His gaze was set intense upon the road ahead, but in his heart lingered an unshakable dread about what awaited them beyond the gates of Dachau. As they drew closer, the camp loomed, a stark contrast to the serene landscape surrounding it. The iron gates, twisted and corroded, seemed to whisper tales of despair. The soldiers' stomachs tightened as they crossed the threshold, carrying with them the weight of its dark history. Suddenly, the scene unfolded before them, a nightmarish tableau that would etch itself into their memories for all time. Men and women stood like shadows against the backdrop of horror, skeletal figures with sunken eyes, overseen by daunting towers that once signaled their utmost suffering. The realization hit hard. This was not merely a military objective, but a moral crucible. With every step further into the compound, the soldiers became aware of the psychological burden they carried, a necessity to confront the reality behind those barbed wires, a reality that often eluded words. Each soldier came face to face with the specter of past atrocities that history books would struggle to capture. Could they truly be the bearer of hope in such a place tainted by unimaginable despair? As the soldiers Schofield and Jong moved deeper into the camp, they were met with expressions of disbelief, terror, and a flicker of long-lost hope from the survivors. For many, liberation felt as distant as freedom itself amid their trauma. The weight of liberation was heavy. The promises of rescue were tainted by memories of horror. As the tension escalated, moments became sharp and vivid. A guard fled, leaving behind the very symbols of his power. The soldiers seized this moment to help reveal what lay hidden. Even amidst the horror, they began to share small doses of kindness, pieces of bread, a touch of compassion, a shared look of understanding. Irony lingered in the air, for while the soldiers sought to liberate those tormented by oppression, they were also confronted with their own humanity. The boundary blurred between savior and witness. They weren't just confronting the enemy before them, but grappling with the depths of human cruelty. April 29, 1945, marked a pivotal moment, not only for the survivors awakened by the rumble of tanks and the voice of freedom, but for the soldiers who would forever carry the scars of liberation. The grim reality was that trauma had no expiration date. Liberation was just the first step toward healing, a pathway now distorted by memories that would haunt both the freed and the liberators alike. In this solemn dawn, hope was on the horizon, yet its arrival would demand confronting the shadows of the past. Liberty awaits, but will healing follow? Echoed through the hearts of those who dared to believe that the gates of Dachau could open not just to freedom, but to a new beginning amidst a foundation of hope. The air held a palpable tension on April 29, 1945, as a heavy silence enveloped the concentration camp of Dachau. The faint sound of distant footsteps echoed against the cold, stark walls, shattering the stillness, until finally the moment arrived. Soldiers from the American 45th Infantry Division stood before the iron gates, poised to breach a nightmare that had persisted for too long. In that very instant, the world outside transformed, as the hinges creaked to life, heralding a new dawn. Inside, survivors clung to the remnants of their shattered lives, bodies frail and spirits dimmed by years of suffering. For them, the gates of Dachau were not merely barriers. They were the very embodiment of torment and despair. As the gates swung open, the cacophony of liberation burst forth. Shouts of victory, sobs of disbelief, and the thunderous chorus of freedom filled the air. The gates had been a prison, now transformed into the threshold of hope. Faces emerged from the shadows, gaunt and lined, yet the flicker of recognition and yearning for life flickered in their eyes. Amidst the chaos, a woman named Hannah stood motionless, tears streaming down her cheeks. She gazed at the soldiers in their American uniforms, heroes in a dark world, and felt the overwhelming surge of emotions that coursed through her. Horror had stripped her of much, yet, clinging to life, had brought her to this moment, where a fragile blossom of hope began to bloom once more. American soldiers surged forward, but it was not in the soldiers' exultation that the heart of the narrative lay. It was in the faces and responses of the survivors. For every soldier's cheer, there was an anguished wail from the past. What was freedom, after all, when one's spirit had been so profoundly battered? Voices strained against the weight of memories, as each step taken toward the gates was met with the horror of what lay behind, as well as the promise of what lay ahead. As laughter erupted and hands grasped in unison, Hannah found herself enveloped in a fellow survivor's embrace, their cries mingling, joy and sorrow entwined, as they grieved and celebrated the loss of lives, both past and present. The soldiers, armed with rifles that had forged their way through the blood of conflict, stood in awe, grappling with an emotional landscape even greater than the battlefield. This was more than the liberation of a camp. It was the confrontation of ghosts, long buried within the recesses of broken hearts. It was a moment on which the seams of history stretched and pulled, where acts of brutal adversity collided violently with an insatiable longing for life. In liberation, there lies a paradox: freedom fortified by pain, and in their release, the survivors face the daunting task of reclaiming their identities amid chaotic joy. As daylight spilled over the scene, illuminating weary faces, laughter echoed into the air like birds taking flight. And yet, Hannah's heart remained heavy. With freedom came the unwritten burden of struggle. A different battle had just begun. It was a battle of memories that would never fade, and fears that would shadow even the brightest days ahead. Each voice told a story. Each tear flowed with a history involuntarily etched into their very souls. The air thickened with unanswered questions, but one truth emerged stronger than the cacophony around them. The moment of liberation would be both a beginning and an end. With trembling hearts, they adjusted from the stifling embrace of darkness to the dizzying expanse of newfound light, knowing they had survived a hell none could fully grasp. As the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows behind them, the realization settled in. Freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the promise of a future against the remnants of the past. And as they stepped out of the dark horrors of Dachau, the journey to reclaim life was only just beginning, and the world outside awaited with open arms. The air was thick with dust and confusion on April 29, 1945, as sunlight poured through the gaping maw of the gates at Dachau concentration camp. American soldiers, weary from the relentless battles of Europe, stood momentarily frozen at the sight before them. The metallic click of the gate echoed against the concrete walls, a sound that resonated through the bodies of the survivors, their eyes widening in disbelief at the sight of liberation, a stark but haunting form of freedom. As the gates swung open, a cacophony of emotions erupted. Tears streamed down the faces of men and women who had long buried their hope beneath layers of despair. Their shouts filled the air, a chaotic symphony of relief mingled with the agonizing memory of suffering. For those who had endured the relentless grip of starvation, the sensation of fresh air rushing over their frail bodies felt surreal. Some fell to their knees, sobbing loudly, while others stood frozen, caught in the throes of both joy and trauma, their expressions a blend of triumph and horror. Among the soldiers was Private First Class William Smith, whose heart raced as he surveyed the scene unfolding before him. He had joined the army not just to fight against tyranny, but to bring an end to suffering. As he looked into the haunted eyes of the survivors, he felt both overwhelmed and powerless. A small group of survivors staggered forward, their bodies weak, but driven by an unyielding desire for human connection. They reached out toward the soldiers, hands trembling, seeking solace in the warmth of another's presence. "You're safe now," one of the soldiers said, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. The words hung in the air, an attempt to bridge the chasm of anguish. Yet those who had endured years of cruelty found it difficult to accept the reality of their newfound freedom. For each joyous reunion, there was a painful reminder of what had been lost: families, friends, and years of their lives stolen away. As the soldiers distributed rations, simple bread, a far cry from the meager scraps the survivors had endured, a palpable tension filled the air. Survivors accepted the food with trembling hands, yet the act of eating felt strange, almost alien. They were not just hungry, but had been starved of dignity, humanity, and the basic joys of life. William watched a child, a mere shadow of a human being, take a morsel of bread and gaze at it as if it were treasure from a distant land. In that fleeting moment, he realized the profound psychological scars that liberation could not easily erase. In hushed conversations, whispers of loss lingered in the air. Survivors shared their harrowing tales with anyone who would listen, recounting the horrors they had witnessed, an indistinct tapestry of pain woven through the oppressive silence of the camp. Each story was a reminder that the wounds ran deeper than physical scars. They carried the weight of years spent in fear, stripped of their identity and stripped of hope. The irony was sharp and bitter. Freedom had arrived, bearing the gift of survival. Yet in its wake lay a complex landscape of grief. For many, joy and sorrow existed hand in hand. Their liberation was a testament to resilience, but also a stark reminder that the journey toward healing was only beginning. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the camp, William could not shake off the feeling that the horrors witnessed that day would haunt them all forever. The fight for dignity and the reclamation of their story had just begun in the shadow of liberation, a bittersweet chapter on the path toward recovery. In the quiet moments that followed, the laughter of reunited families mingled with the sound of a breaking heart, and as the soldiers bore witness to both despair and joy, they understood one undeniable truth. The battle for the mind would require as much courage as the one fought in the battlefield. The road ahead would be fraught with obstacles, but for those who survived, it was a path fraught with the possibility of redemption if only they could find a way to navigate through the darkness. April 29th, 1945. The air felt heavy with dread as the morning fog clung to the ground like a shroud. The distant rumble of tanks echoed in the oppressive silence, blending with the cries of the liberated. The American soldiers, weary from their long march across Europe, found themselves approaching the gates of Dachau, one of the first concentration camps to be established by the Nazis. As they stood before the wrought iron gates, a grim reality unfolded before their eyes, a vision they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Inside, the conditions that awaited them were unfathomable. Terrible stench hung in the air. The remnants of desperation and despair intertwined with the flickering hope of freedom. The soldiers' hearts sank as they bore witness to the skeletal remains of humanity, a haunting testament to the horrors inflicted over the years. It was here, amid the dilapidated barracks and emaciated figures, that they began to understand the weight of their duty. Armed not just with rifles, but with empathy, they took it upon themselves to document the atrocities that had taken place. Sergeant James Kelly, a photographer before the war, instinctively raised his camera. His hands shook, not just from the cold, but with the magnitude of what he was about to capture. Behind the lens, he saw survivors clutching one another, tears streaming down their faces, grief and joy intertwined in a landscape of suffering. His photos would become the stark, unfiltered truth of the Holocaust, a record of despair meant to wake the world from its slumber. Alongside him, Private Richard Thompson fought back the tide of emotions. Each image he encountered pierced his heart like an icy arrow. He sought to comfort the survivors, offering them food and water, all while processing the trauma unfolding around him. "I can't believe this is real," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet, in that moment, it was all too real, as the weight of their shared humanity crashed down around the soldiers. In a desperate effort to bring insight to their experiences, the soldiers began to write letters home. Each word spilled from shaking hands, detailing the unimaginable sorrow and horror. The things we've seen, words, don't do it justice. They penned their encounters, reminding themselves of the humanity they fought for. It was a cathartic release, even as they tried to evade the deep-rooted fear that lingered in the corners of their minds. Among the ranks, Lieutenant Sarah Green emerged, resolute and fiercely committed to documenting the events. We must gather testimonials. She felt a responsibility to ensure that these voices, once silenced, would echo through history. With a notebook scribbled with questions cascading from her mind, she approached the survivors, listening intently to their fragmented stories of loss. They spoke of names, of families erased, of lives that would never see the light of day again. It was both heartbreaking and vital, a reminder of the purpose behind their liberation. As the soldiers secured the camp, tensions heightened. They faced the grim reality that many still bore the scars of brutality, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Each soldier struggled to reconcile their role as liberators with their own horror, grappling with visions that would haunt their dreams. In those moments, as they recorded and documented, they began to realize that their own humanity was at stake. In the aftermath, they were tasked not only with chronicling the atrocities, but also with preserving the memories of those lives taken too soon. They understood that their mission extended far beyond the battlefield. The memory of those who suffered must be eternal. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground, the soldiers stood united, changed forever. The weight of what they uncovered loomed large, as did their determination to ensure the world heard the stories buried beneath the ashes of history. This day marked the beginning of a commitment to truth, a promise whispered amongst them they would never forget. As the sun rose on April 29, 1945, a soft breeze rustled through the heavy silence enveloping the barracks of Dachau concentration camp. The air was thick with a stench of decay. The memories of horror lingered like a dark shadow. Faces expressing facial expressions etched with fear slowly turned toward the unfamiliar sounds echoing through the camp. The mechanical whir of American trucks and the heavy boots of soldiers breaking the routine of despair. Among the liberated was a young woman named Miriam Schneider, only 20 years old, but aged beyond her years. The camp's brutality had stolen her childhood, yet as she stepped through the open gate that day, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and hope. Miriam had once dreamed of a life filled with music and love, of laughter echoing through her family home in Munich. Instead, she had spent those years in a nightmare, stripped of her identity, her dignity, her very essence. Then there was Samuel Weiss, who had been separated from his family upon arrival at the camp. The news of their fate loomed over him like a shroud. Despite the desperate conditions, Samuel had held on to the memories of his father teaching him the Torah, their voices blending in harmonized prayers of resilience. As the gates swung wide open, those sacred words returned in a rush, mingling with the shouts of freedom, echoing from the American soldiers. Every step he took outside the gates ignited a painful longing, yet also a flickering flame of survival. Life in Dachau was a daily fight for existence, each moment a testament to human strength. Miriam and Samuel, amidst a sea of gaunt and hollow-eyed survivors, caught each other's gaze. In that fleeting moment, the weight of their shared trauma transformed into an unspoken bond, a silent acknowledgement that they had emerged from the ashes, somehow, together. Their stories were not isolated. Around them, others began to emerge from the clutches of despair. Elena, a former schoolteacher who had focused on nurturing the dreams of her students, was free at last. Yet what tormented her most was the knowledge of those dreams extinguished, lives dismantled. She envisioned reconstructing her classroom, creating a world where knowledge flourished rather than faltered in fear. The thought of guiding young minds again gave her strength to move forward. These individuals, each representing strength that had been forged in the crucible of suffering, found a new purpose. As the soldiers offered them food, clothing, and warmth, those acts of kindness were a tangible reminder that love and humanity could still exist amid the ruins of cruelty. The liberation was not just a physical release from shackles. It was the rekindling of hope, a chance to reclaim their identities ripped from them in the darkness. In the ensuing days, they began to share their stories with one another. They exchanged names, moments from their past, and the dreams that had once inhabited their futures. Their laughter was hesitant at first, but gradually it grew louder, filling the once desolate grounds of Dachau with a renewed spirit. Their fractured lives began to form a tapestry of resilience, illustrating an undeniable truth. They had survived, and they would strive to live once more. As they gathered, the chilling whispers of the past haunted them still, yet every act of remembrance became a step toward healing. The scars would remain, but from them a new narrative would emerge, one of resilience, community, and a refusal to allow the darkness of their past to dictate a future shrouded in despair. Miriam, Samuel, and Elena, though forever altered by their experiences, stood at the threshold of a new beginning, united by their shared horror and collective hope. The road ahead would be challenging, fraught with reminders of their trauma, but together they would seek the light that had been so painfully dimmed. The faces of the liberated reflected not just survival, but the courageous heart of humanity itself, forever changed, yet still beating, still dreaming. As the smoke began to clear from the tumultuous winds of war, the survivors of the concentration camps faced a daunting new reality on that fateful day in April 1945. It was a time marked not just by liberation, but by the stark burden of reclaiming a life that had been stolen from them. The gates of Buchenwald had swung open, and unlike the past, which had held absolute darkness, a flicker of hope ignited in their hearts. Amid the rubble of despair, families sought each other, their faces marked by disbelief and hunger for connection. It was a fragile reunion in a land that had been stripped of its humanity. Miriam, a slender woman whose spirit had somehow clung to life, stood in the remnants of what was once her home. Her eyes searched the faces around her, awash with tears of sorrow, but holding the glimmer of a new dawn. Each embrace she exchanged echoed the emotional tumult of loss, resilience, and an utter yearning for a future beyond the ash of captivity. Rebuilding their lives proved to be a labyrinthine challenge. Resources were scarce, and survival necessitated communal strength. The shadows of trauma hovered, invading the quiet moments that should have been filled with joy. Men and women, shaped by suffering, summoned their collective resolve and worked together, fostering makeshift shelters from the ruins. The community that began to blossom, though strained, brought a sense of purpose to many. As Miriam joined her fellow survivors in community kitchens and makeshift schools, she found comfort in their shared mission to nurture not just their bodies, but their shattered spirits. Tales of the past haunted their gatherings. Survivors spoke softly of vanished loved ones, of escape routes never taken, and of a world that had failed them. The psychological weight was great, and nights often found them haunted by memories that surged forth unbidden. Yet from this pain, a sense of camaraderie grew. They formed support networks, seeking solace and understanding within the arms of those who had traveled through similar valleys of despair. It was where they gathered to speak openly, the shared knowledge of survival becoming a lifeline. But resilience often comes at a price. As they retraced the steps of their memories, some found their identities rewritten by grief. Yet Miriam refused to let the shadows define her. Each day, she walked among the rubble, gathering fragments of what once was. A picture here, a keepsake there. Slowly but surely, she stitched together both her world and her sense of self. Though the road ahead was filled with uncertainty, glimmers of hope sparked in the hearts of many as they pursued joy amid the aching scars. The local townspeople, once indifferent or frightened, began offering their hands in friendship. The sight of American soldiers in the nearby camps brought not only relief, but curiosity. They stood together, victims and liberators, seeking to build a bridge towards collective healing. Miriam felt a blooming spirit of acceptance grow, a silent acknowledgement that they were all survivors in their own right. Slowly, the whispers of the past transformed into a reaffirmation of life. In this new beginning, the laughter of children filled the air, mingling with the rustling leaves, a sound foreign yet beautiful. Sports, arts, and gatherings started to flourish as laughter broke through the solemnity. The survivors began to reclaim their identities and dreams that had once been buried beneath the weight of their suffering. Hope had ignited, illuminating a path forward. While the scars of the past would always remain, the survivors forged ahead together, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. They had been broken, yet in their unity, they found the strength to rise, to rebuild, and to dream. In the heart of Europe, life began anew, irrevocably changed, yet filled with the promise of what lay ahead. The sun dipped low on April 29, 1945, casting long shadows over the grounds of the infamous Dachau concentration camp. The air was thick with despair and disbelief, broken only by the rustle of the soldiers' uniforms and the poignant silence of survivors who had waited in torment for what felt like an eternity. The gate swung open, a pivotal moment painted against the backdrop of a world shocked by the atrocities laid bare before them. As the American soldiers stepped forward, they were not merely entering a compound of barbed wire and crumbling walls. They were crossing into a living graveyard, where history had scarred humanity, and dreams of hope hung by a thread. Among the soldiers was Captain Ronald Spears, whose heart raced with a mix of dread and determination as he took in the scene, the skeletal figures of men and women who had endured unimaginable horrors. The air crackled with tension as the gates swung wide, revealing the haggard expressions of those who survived. Overwhelmed by emotions, many of the weary survivors fell to their knees, tears streaming down gaunt faces, a mix of relief and disbelief overcoming them. Their silent cries echoed louder than words, reverberating through every soul present. This was not just liberation, it was an awakening. In that instant, the psychological impact on soldiers and survivors alike was immense. For those who had witnessed the extent of human cruelty, the revelation of just how deeply hatred could corrupt took root. The lessons of this day would shape their understanding of humanity and morality, stressing the necessity of remembrance. Captain Spears later reflected, saying, "What we saw that day was not just a testament to human suffering, but a call to action before we become the monsters we fight against." As the soldiers collaborated with a few courageous locals who had come to help, their unity embodied a flicker of hope in the darkness of history. Each survivor's story, one of theme parks, turned into prisons, food rations reduced to dust, became a testament to resilience, inspiring a generation to wield their memories like a sword against tyranny. Years later, as those who lived through the horrors recounted their testimonies, their voices became a bridge for future generations, a way to ensure that such tragedies never wove themselves into the fabric of society again. To remember is to care, and to care is to act. In reflecting on that harrowing day, it becomes clear that liberation is not merely the act of opening gates. It's the strength found in stories shared, the bonds forged in humanity's darkest moments. The testimonies of survivors serve as solemn reminders that the past must not only be remembered, but studied and learned from. As the narrative draws to a close, we honor those who stood at the gates of change, the blood and courage spilled for a future united against hatred. In this remembrance lies the ultimate act of defiance against history's grim chapters, engraved in the hearts of all who resolve to never forget.